On a night when the snow was strong enough to bury a man alive, Caleb Hart saw a light burning where no light should be. In an abandoned barn, he found a widow, 3 starving children, and a secret that a powerful banker would kill to keep hidden. What Caleb did next would not only save a family, it would force an entire town to decide what kind of people they truly were. This story reminds us that the poorest person in town may still carry the richest truth, and that real courage means refusing to cross the road when someone needs help. You are ready for a story of love, justice, and redemption. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe before we begin.
The storm came down off the mountains like it had a grudge. Caleb Hart had ridden through bad weather before, most of his life, in fact. But this was the kind of cold that didn't argue with you. It just took what it wanted. The wind drove the snow sideways, and his horse kept its head low. And Caleb pulled his collar up and counted the fence posts he couldn't see anymore. That was when he caught it. A flicker of light off to the east where nothing ought to be. The old Briggs barn sat on the far edge of his land. Empty 2 winters now, maybe 3. The family that worked it had packed up and gone, the way folks did, out here, quiet, and without a forwarding address. There was no reason for a light in that barn. No good reason, anyhow. Caleb turned the horse. He told himself it was probably trappers, maybe a drifter. He told himself a lot of things in the time it took to cross that field. But when he swung down at the barn door and pushed inside, every one of them went still in his chest. A woman stood against the far wall, 3 children behind her, and in her hand, held out in front of her like it meant something, was a paring knife, dull, the kind you'd use on an apple. She didn't lower it. "I don't have anything worth stealing," she said. Her voice shook, but her eyes didn't. "But I'll cut you if you come near them." Caleb stood real still. The fire she'd built was small and dying. The 2 older children were pressed into the straw, and the littlest one, a baby, by the size of the bundle, was tucked up tight against the woman's coat. He could see their breath. He could see hers. He could see how little of any of it there was left. He took his hat off, slow. "Mammy said you can put that down. Nobody here's going to hurt anybody." That's what a man says right before he does. It's also what a man says when it's true. He kept his hands where she could see them. "This is my land. That's my barn. And I'll tell you the truth, I came in here ready to run somebody off." He looked at the children, at the boy's cracked lips, at the baby. "But I'm not going to do that." The woman's arm trembled. From the cold, he thought, or from holding it up so long. "You haven't stolen a thing from me," Caleb said. "You're just trying to live. There's no crime in that. Out here, we don't let folks freeze to death, not even strangers. That's not charity, ma'am. That's just what's right." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the boy started to cry. Not loud. The worn-out kind, the kind a child cries when he's too tired to do anything else. And the woman's face broke just a little at the corner, and the knife came down. Caleb crossed the barn and dropped to one knee in front of the children. He shrugged out of his coat. Good wool, warm from his body, and laid it over the 2 older ones like a blanket. The boy looked up at him with eyes too big for his face. "There," Caleb said. "That's better, isn't it?" The girl, the older one, watched him the way a grown woman watches a man she doesn't trust yet. 9, maybe 10, old in the eyes. "Can you walk?" Caleb asked her. She nodded. "Good girl." He turned to the woman. "The baby. Let me carry her. My horse can take 2, and you'll need your arms for the little one's brother." She hesitated. Of course you did. You don't hand your child to a stranger in a barn at night. But the cold was deciding things for all of them now. And she knew it. She passed the bundle into his hand, and Caleb Hart, who had not held an infant in 6 years, looked down at the small, sleeping face and felt his hands begin to shake. It wasn't the cold. He'd buried a son about this size, and a wife who'd carried him. He'd shut a door inside himself that day and nailed it closed, and he'd thought it would stay that way. He'd been glad of it staying that way. A man can't lose what he won't hold. But here was this weight, this warm, breathing weight, and the door he'd nailed shut leaned open just an inch. "What's her name?" he asked. His voice came out rougher than he meant. "Pearl," the woman said. "Pearl." He nodded, like the name settled something. "All right, Pearl. Let's get you somewhere warm." The ride back was slow and bitter and silent, except for the wind. The woman rode behind him with the boy in her lap. The girl walked the last stretch, holding the stirrup, too proud to ask to be carried, and Caleb let her keep her pride, because it was about all she had left, and he wasn't going to take it. The lights of Heart's Rest came up out of the dark, like something a man might pray for. Bess had the door open before he'd even reined in. She stood there in her shawl, lamp in hand, ready to scold him for being out in it. Then the lamplight fell on the woman behind him, and Bess went white as the snow on the rail. The scolding never came. Her mouth opened and closed. The lamp shook in her grip, and the warm light wobbled across all their faces. The children, the baby, the stranger. Lord above, Bess whispered. She took one step back. Caleb. Her voice had gone thin and strange. Do you have any idea who that woman is? Bess didn't answer her own question. She just stood there in the doorway, with the lamp shaking, looking at the woman on the horse, like she'd seen a ghost climb up out of the snow. And maybe she had. Out here, the dead and the living got talked about in the same breath sometime. A name could outlast a person by years. Bess. Caleb kept his voice low, the kind of low you use around a spooked animal. Whoever she is, she's half frozen. And so are these children. We'll do the knowing later. Right now, we do the warming. That broke the spell. Bess was a practical woman before she was anything else. And practical women don't let babies freeze while they gawk. She set the lamp down hard on the rail, and her hands went to work. Inside, all of you. Now, she reached up for the boy and pulled him off the horse and onto her hip, like he weighed nothing. There's a fire in the kitchen, and there's going to be food in about 4 minutes, whether the stove likes it or not. Caleb handed the baby down to Bess. Then he helped the woman from the saddle. She came down stiff, her legs not quite hers anymore, and she caught herself on his arm and let go the second she had her feet. He noticed that. The letting go. Some people, you help them, and they grab on. They sink into it. This one took only what she needed and not 1 ounce more. Like help was a thing she'd have to pay for later. And she meant to keep the bill small. Inside, the kitchen was gold and warm. The children went straight for the stove, the way moths go for a lamp. Bess had broth on before the door was shut meat and root vegetables, the smell of it filling the room, and when she set the bowls down, the older girl looked at the food and then up at her mother, waiting for permission, like she'd learned the hard way not to assume there'd be enough. Go on, child, Bess said. Eat. The girl ate slow and careful, watching the door the whole time. The boy ate like a boy. The mother didn't eat at all until both her children had bowls in front of them. And only then did she sit, and only then did her shoulders come down from around her ears. Caleb stood by the wall and watched and said nothing. When the children had eaten and started to nod off where they sat, Bess took them off to the spare room with the baby, and the woman moved to follow, and Caleb said, "A moment, ma'am, if you can spare it." She stopped, squared up to him, tired but ready. "I can spare it. Bess knows you," he said, "or knows of you. I don't. I'd rather hear your name from you than from anyone else." "Naomi Carter." He waited. "My husband was Daniel Carter." She said the name the way you set down something heavy. "We had a homestead east of the river, past the Hadley place. 40 acres and a cabin he built with his own hand." A pause. "Had. What happened?" "The bank happened to it." Her chin came up. "Mr. Thorne's bank. There was a note Daniel signed when the wheat failed 2 years running. We were behind. We knew we were behind. We'd have caught up." Her voice stayed level, but it cost her. "Thorne called the whole note due at once in November. He knew what he was doing. A man can't pay a year's note in 30 days in the dead of winter. Nobody can. That's the point of doing it." And Daniel, for the first time, her eyes went somewhere else, somewhere he couldn't follow. "Daniel died 3 weeks after we lost the place," she said. "His heart. That's what the doctor wrote down. His heart." She let that sit. "I think it broke, is what I think. A man builds something with his hands, and another man takes it with a pen. And there's nothing you can do. And you carry that. Some men can carry it. Daniel couldn't." The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the wind kept on. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. And he meant it. which was more than most people meant when they said it. Everybody's sorry. She said it without heat, just tired. Sorry doesn't keep a roof on. The boarding house in town turned us out 4 days ago. Mrs. Pruitt was sorry, too. She was real sorry. She still put us in the street. Naomi looked at him straight. So I found your barn. I'm not going to pretend I didn't know. It was somebody's. I knew. I made a choice. If that makes me a thief, then I'm a thief. And you can do what you want about it. It doesn't make you a thief. Folks in town would say different. Folks in town aren't standing in my kitchen. Caleb pulled out a chair, turned it around, sat with his arms across the back. Mrs. Carter, I'm not going to put you out. Not tonight. Not while it's like this outside. I want that clear. Something flickered across her face. Relief. Maybe. But she didn't reach for it. She didn't let it land. And after the weather breaks, she said, that's the part we ought to talk about. She nodded slowly. He watched her gather herself the way a person does before they say a thing that's hard to say. I won't take charity, Naomi said. I want you to understand that before you offer me any. I've had 4 days of people being kind to me on their way to shutting the door. The pity and the door come together. I'm done with both. She drew a breath. But I'll work. I can cook, though not like your best. I can clean, and I clean well. I can mend. I can keep accounts. I can read and figure better than most men who run shops. You give me a place for my children, dry and warm, and I will earn every inch of it, every meal. I'm not asking for a handout, Mr. Hart. I'm asking for a job. Caleb was quiet a moment. You know, he said, most folks in your spot would just say yes and thank me and worry about the rest later. I'm not no, he said. I'm starting to see that. He stood up, walked to the window. The storm threw itself against the glass, and beyond it, there was nothing but dark and snow, and his land somewhere under all of it. Being poor isn't a sin, Mrs. Carter, he said to the window. I don't know who taught this country otherwise, but they taught it wrong. A man can lose everything he owns and not lose 1 ounce of what he's worth. Those are 2 different ledgers. Folks get them confused. He turned around. You losing that homestead doesn't tell me a single thing about who you are. What you do next tells me. And what I just watched you do is feed your children before yourself and offer to work before you'd take a thing for free. That tells me plenty. Naomi stood very still, like she wasn't sure she'd heard him right, like the words had come from a direction she wasn't watching. Then we have a deal, she said. Careful, testing the ice. We have a deal. I'll start tonight. You'll sleep tonight. You've earned that much already just by surviving the week. I'll start tonight, she said again, and there was no give in it. And Caleb understood that this was not about the work. This was about her standing on her own 2 feet in a strange house and needing to know she could, needing to leave a mark that said I was here and I paid my way. So he let her. Kitchen's yours then, he said. Bess'll show you where things live in the morning. Don't burn the place down. A flicker at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, but the country it came from. Caleb went up to bed and didn't sleep. He lay in the dark and listened to the house. He heard the woman moving around downstairs, the scrape of a pail, water poured, the slow, steady rhythm of someone scrubbing a floor at 2 in the morning. Because it was the only thing in the world she had the power to do. Around 3, he got up. He didn't go down. He went to the spare room instead, quiet, and stood in the doorway. The children were asleep in the one bed, all 3 tangled together for warmth out of habit, even now that they didn't need to be. The baby breathed in little catches. The boy had one arm flung over his sister's neck. The girl, even sleeping, had a crease between her brows, like she was solving something. The door latch was broken. He'd known that. Hadn't mattered before it was a spare room. Caleb went and got his tools. He worked by the light from the hall, quiet as he could, and he fixed the latch so it caught firm, and a child inside could turn it and feel safe. He didn't think too hard about why it mattered that a child in his house feels safe behind a door that locked. He just did it. Some things a man does with his hands before his head has caught up to the reason. When he was done, he stood there a second longer than he needed to. Then he went back to bed. Naomi scrubbed until the kitchen floor gave back the lamplight. She scrubbed past the point of clean into the place where the work stops being about the floor and starts being about the hands needing something to do. so the heart can hold still. She was on her knees by the stove when the first gray came into the windows. She got up. Her back screamed at her. She let it. She put the pail away and washed her face in the cold water and looked for one moment at her reflection swimming in the dark glass. Naomi Carter, she told the woman in the window, you are still here. The children are warm. You did that. It would have to be enough. It was always going to have to be enough. She was setting the table for the children's breakfast when she heard the sound outside. Wheels. The crunch and squeak of a carriage on packed snow, coming up the drive slow and certain, the way only a fine carriage comes one that's never once had to worry about getting stuck. She went to the window. A black carriage stood in the yard, a driver up front, breath steaming, and the back, leaning to peer out the little window with naked, hungry curiosity, was a woman in a fur collar Naomi had seen exactly once before, in town, the day they'd lost the homestead. Mrs. Verna Thorne, the banker's wife, had not come at dawn through the snow to call on Caleb Hart about anything good. Naomi knew that the way she knew weather. You feel it before it arrives. And those bright hunting eyes were already fixed on the kitchen window. Fixed, in fact, on her. A thing about small town. A secret travels faster than a horse can. By the time Sunday came around, Mercy Creek already knew that Caleb Hart, who hadn't so much as looked sideways at a woman in 6 years, had a widow and 3 children living out at Hart's Rest. Knew she was the Carter woman, the one the bank had put out. Knew because Verna Thorne had made certain. Everyone knew that she'd been found in a barn at night, half wild, threatening a man with a knife. Nobody knew the parts that mattered. Nobody ever does. The town traded the shape of the thing without once touching the truth of it. Caleb had heard the talk by Saturday. Gaines, his foreman, brought it back from town like a man bringing back a snake he'd found in the feed. Thought you'd want to know what's being said, Gaines told him. Before you walk into church, not knowing what's being said, Gaines shifted. That you've taken up with. That a man your age and your money doesn't do a thing like this unless somebody's got her hooks in him. Mrs. Thorne's been telling it real generous around town. Adds a little each time. Caleb listened to all of it with his face still. And what do you think, Gaines? The foreman looked at him. He was a hard old man who didn't waste words. I think I've worked for you 11 years, he said, and I've never once seen you do a cruel thing or a foolish one. I figure I'll trust that over Verna Thorne's mouth, he spat. But I'm one man. The town's a lot of mouths. That night, Caleb knocked on the spare room door. Naomi opened. Behind her, the children were doing their letters on a slate Bess had dug up the girl. Mercy, guiding the boy's hand around an E. Sunday tomorrow, Caleb said. We go to church. The children, too. If you're willing. Naomi's face closed up like a door in wind. I know what they're saying in town. I'd have to be deaf not to. You'd do better to leave us home. Folks will behave worse, with us sitting right there in front of them. That, said Caleb, is exactly why we're going to sit right there in front of them. She studied him. You don't have to do this. You can let me and the children worship at home. You don't owe me your reputation. It isn't about owing. He leaned on the doorframe. Mrs. Carter, a man's reputation isn't worth much if it only holds up when it costs him nothing. We'll go to church. We'll sit in my pew. And if folks have something to say, they can say it to my face on the Lord's Day and see how that sits with. So Sunday morning they went. The church at Mercy Creek was a plain white building with a stove that never quite reached the back rows. It filled up slow families stamping snow off their boots. The smell of wet wool and cold air, the low murmur of people who all knew each other's business and pretended they didn't. The murmur changed when Caleb came in. He came in with Naomi beside him and the children in front, and he walked them up the center aisle to the second pew from the front, where the Hart family had sat for as long as there'd been a Hart family in this county. He stood and let everyone get a good look. Then he stepped aside and let Naomi go in first, and the children after. And he sat on the aisle like a man guarding a gate. The murmur turned to a hiss of whispers. Mercy, 9 years old and old in the eyes, sat with her spine straight as a fence post and stared at the front of the church and did not let her face do one single thing. Naomi had taught her that, Caleb realized, how to be looked at, how to wear it. In the third pew, Verna Thorne leaned to the woman beside her and said something behind her glove, and the woman's eyes flicked to Naomi and away. Caleb watched a flush climb the back of Naomi's neck. He didn't say anything. He just shifted a little, so that his shoulder came up like a wall between her and the row behind. A small thing. She felt it. She didn't look at him, but her chin came up that quarter-inch he was learning to recognize. Then Reverend Hale stood up, and the whispering stopped, because it had to. Hale was a lean man with white in his beard and a voice bigger than his frame. He looked out over his congregation a long moment before he spoke, and his eyes, Caleb would swear to it, touched the whispering rose on the way. "I had a sermon ready," Hale said. "I'm going to set it aside." A rustle. People sitting up. "I want to talk about the road to Jericho," he said. "You know this. A man set upon by robbers, beaten, robbed, left in the ditch to die. And down that road comes a priest, a good man, a respectable man, a church-going man, like every soul in this room. And he sees the wounded fellow lying there. And he crosses to the other side of the road. And he keeps walking." The church had gone very still. Then a Levite, another good man, same thing, sees the trouble, crosses the road, keeps walking, tells himself it's not his affair, tells himself somebody else will see to it, tells himself the man in the ditch likely did something to land there. Hale paused, and maybe he did. The story doesn't say. The story doesn't care. That's the point of the story. He let it breathe. It's a stranger who stops. A foreigner. A man this town would have crossed the road to avoid on a good day. He's the one who kneels in the dirt. He's the one who pays out of his own pocket for the wounded man's care. He's the one who acts like a neighbor, while the respectable men were busy being respectable on the far side of the road. Hale set both hands on the pulpit. "I'll tell you what I take from it. It's not the man in the ditch who's lost his way. It's the man who crosses the road to keep his hands clean. He's the one who's wandered off from God and doesn't even know it, because he's still walking to church on Sunday." He looked out at them. "We are awful quick in this town to ask what a person did to deserve their trouble. I'd ask you to try a harder question. What are you going to do now that you've seen them?" Nobody whispered after that. Caleb did not look at Verna Thorne. He didn't need to. He could feel the heat coming off that pew without turning his head. Afterward, in the churchyard, people did the thing people do. Clumped up, talked in low voices, watched the heart pew empty out into the cold, and decided, each in their own heart, what they thought about it. A few came over. Old Mrs. Aldous took Naomi's hand and held it, and said nothing at all, which said everything. A rancher named Pell tipped his hat to her like she was anybody's wife. Small thing, doors opening a crack, and some doors stayed shut, and you could see which one. It was by the wagons that the other thing happened. Isaiah Boone had brought the children's coats out and was helping the boy into his Isaiah, being the one man on the place who could get Eli to hold still. And a fellow Caleb knew by sight, a teamster named Coombs, said something low to the man beside him, said it with a laugh, said it loud enough to carry, the way men do, want a thing heard, but want to be able to claim they didn't. Didn't know we let the help worship up front now. It wasn't even about Naomi. It was about Isaiah, about the color of him standing there, doing a kindness for a child. Isaiah's hands went still on the boy's buttons, just for a second. Then he kept on, easy, like he hadn't heard, because a man like Isaiah had learned a long time ago that hearing cost more than not hearing. But Caleb had heard. He walked over, not fast. He didn't have to be fast. He was Caleb Hart, and the yard went quiet around him, the way it does around a man with land and a name. Coombs, Mr. Hart. Wary now. "That man you just made your little joke about," Caleb said, and his voice carried fine on its own, is named Isaiah Boone. "He's the best hand with a horse in this county, and I'd know, because I've got the best stock in this county, and he's why. He just helped a cold child into his coat, which is more Christian than anything you've done since you walked out of that building." Coombs's face went red. "I didn't mean I expect you didn't think at all," Caleb said. "That's the trouble. Now you listen, and the rest of you can listen too." since you're all working so hard to pretend you aren't. He turned, slow, taking in the yard. There's an idea going around this town that you can measure a man by his money, by his color, by whether his wife's alive or his land's still his. And I'm telling you, it's a lie, and a coward's lie at that, because it lets you feel tall by making somebody else small. The yard was dead quiet now. Every soul in that church just heard the Reverend say it plain. Caleb went on. It's not the one in the ditch who's lost. It's the ones crossing the road. Isaiah Boone is owed the same respect as any man here. The same handshake, the same use of his name. No more, and I'll fight any man who tries to give him more out of guilt, but no less. Not 1 inch less. And if that's a hard thing for you to swallow, friend, then you go on and choke on it. But you'll do it somewhere off my sight. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back, which was its own kind of statement, and put his hand on Eli's small shoulder and walked the family to the wagon. Isaiah caught his eye just once, didn't say thank you. A man like Isaiah didn't hand out thank yous for being treated like a man that would have been agreeing he was owed less to start with. He just gave Caleb a short nod, equal to equal, and that was the whole of it. And it was enough. Naomi climbed up into the wagon and looked at Caleb a long moment with something new in her face. Not gratitude, something steadier than that. You make enemies easy, she said quietly. I make them honest, Caleb said. Easier to know where a man stands when he's standing against you. The enemy didn't wait long. 2 days on, Caleb rode into town for nails and grain with a sack over his shoulder when Augustus Thorne stepped out of the bank and crossed the street to meet him. Thorne was a soft-handed man in a good coat. He had a smile he kept for occasions, and he was wearing it now, which was how Caleb knew to be careful. Caleb, like they were friends. A word. Say it. I'll be brief. You're a sensible man, so I'll speak sensibly. Thorne's smile held. You've taken in the Carter widow. That's your affair. A generous gesture. The town's talking, but the town always talks. He spread his soft hand. I only think you ought to know, before you let this go any further, that there are things about that woman and about your own land that you don't know. Things I do know, and a sensible man hears them from a friend before he hears them from the law. The wind came down the street between them. The law, Caleb said. I'm only saying. Thorne's smile didn't move, but his eyes did. There are deeds, Caleb. There are records. There's a question of what's whose out past the river, and who's got a right to what runs through it. He patted Caleb's arm once, like a man patting a horse he meant to sell. Come see me. Before you build something on ground that isn't yours. He turned and walked back toward the bank, unhurried, certain. A man who'd never once had to worry about getting stuck. And Caleb Hart stood in the cold street with a sack of nails on his shoulder, and the first true chill of the whole hard winter going down his spine. Because Thorne hadn't been bluffing. He'd been too calm to be bluffing. The man knew something. Whatever Thorne knew, he kept it. And the not knowing sat in Caleb's chest all through the next stretch of weeks, like a stone he couldn't set down. But a ranch doesn't wait on a man's worries. Winter came down hard and stayed. The real winter. The kind that kills careless men and careless cattle, and there was too much to do to spend long on anything but doing it. The days closed in short and white. The work went on by lamplight at both ends, and inside the house, without any body but assigning it a rhythm settled. Naomi was up before Bess, and that was saying something. By the time Caleb came down, stamping the cold off his boots, there was coffee, and the kitchen was warm, and the children were fed and set to some task. She'd been true to her word about the work. She did the accounts in an evening that had been taking Caleb 3. She mended what was torn. She found the soft rot in the south cellar that would have cost him half his stored apples. And she found it because she'd thought to look, which nobody else had. She earned her place. She made sure of it. She'd have walked back out into the snow before she'd have taken a meal she felt she hadn't paid for. But the thing Caleb hadn't reckoned on was the schooling. It started with the slate. Mercy had it most evenings, working the boy through his letters at the kitchen table while Naomi did the books. And one night, Caleb noticed there were more children at that table than belonged to the house. The Boone children were there. Isaiah's two, a girl about Mercy's age and a smaller boy. And the Pell girl from the next place over, who'd ridden the 2 miles with her father. Because, Pell said, gruff about it, her mother heard there was teaching going on, and the school in town don't take. He hadn't finished. He hadn't needed to. The school in town didn't take Isaiah's children either. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched. Naomi had pushed the books aside. She had 6 children around the table now, of 3 different families and more than one color, and she was teaching all of them off the one slate. Like was the most natural thing in the world. She didn't sort them. She didn't seat them by who their fathers were. She just taught. See, she was saying. Hard sound, like cat, like Caleb. The little ones laughed at that, Caleb's name. She glanced up and caught him in the doorway and didn't stop. Mercy, show Sarah how you make the curve. Show her, then let her find it. The Boone girl, Sarah, bent over the slate, tongue between her teeth, and made a wobbling letter, and looked up. That's it, Naomi said. That's exactly it. You did that. Remember, you did it. The next time something tells you that you can't. Caleb came in and sat on the end of the bench, big and out of place among the children, and nobody minded him, which was its own small wonder. When the lesson broke up and the children scattered to their coats, he stayed. You didn't have to take all of them on, he said. You've got work enough. I know I didn't have to. Naomi wiped the slate clean with a rag. That's rather the point of doing it. She set the slate down. The school in town won't have the Boone children. Won't have the Pell girl either, on account of who her mother's people are. Did you know that? I knew, and you let it stand. It isn't my school. No. She looked at him, and there wasn't heat in it, but there wasn't softness either. It isn't anybody's, the way they tell it. It belongs to the town, and the town's decided whose children get to learn and whose don't, which is a strange thing for a town to decide. Letters don't know the difference. The alphabet never once asked a child what his father did or what color his hands were before it let him learn to read. Caleb didn't have anything to say to that, so he didn't say anything. I'll tell you what I told my Mercy. Naomi went on, quieter now. She folded the rag, smoothed it on the table. The day they took our homestead, she was crying not for the land. She didn't understand the land, but because I was. And I sat her down and I said, Mercy, listen to me. They can take the cabin. They can take the 40 acres and the wheat and the table your father built. They can take every single thing we own. And a pen and a piece of paper is all it takes for them to do it. She looked up. But there is one thing, she said, that no bank and no rich man and no law on God's earth can take out of your head once it's in there. And that's what you know. The reading and the figuring and the thinking. Get that inside you. And you carry it out of any fire. To learn, she told her daughter, is to be free. It's the one freedom they can't foreclose on. The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked. That's why I take all of them on, Naomi said, because the ones they shut out of the schoolhouse are exactly the ones who need that freedom most. A rich man's son will land on his feet, whether he can read or not. It's the Boone children and the Pell girl who'll need every letter I can put in them. She stood and gathered her book. So yes, Mr. Hart, I took all of them on. I'd take twice as many if your kitchen would hold them. Caleb watched her go up the stairs. He sat a while longer at the empty table. Then he got up and went and found Bess and asked her how much it would cost to build a proper room onto the back of the house, with its own stove and benches. Bess looked at him a long moment. You're a strange one, Caleb Hart, she said, but she was smiling when she said it. The thing with Isaiah happened on a Thursday. It was the worst kind of day. Too cold to do much, but too much to do to stop. The teaching had gone on through the winter, and somewhere in there, the grown men had started lingering at the edges of it, pretending they were just warming up, pretending they weren't listening. Isaiah Boone lingered the longest. He'd send his children in and stand by the door with his hat in his hands, and he'd watch his girl Sarah make her letters, and there'd be a look on his face that Caleb recognized, but couldn't have named. Hunger was the closest word, the hunger of a man watching his child do an easy thing he himself had been kept from. This Thursday, the children had gone out, and Isaiah hadn't. Naomi saw him standing there. She didn't make a thing of it. She just slid the slate across the table and set the chalk on top and said, like it was nothing, "You've been watching close enough to know how it's done. Isaiah, sit down and write your name." Isaiah didn't move. "I don't." He stopped, started over, and his voice came out careful. "Never learned my letters, Mrs. Carter. Wasn't allowed to where I came up. It was against the law to teach me. A man could go to prison for putting a book in my hands." He turned his hat in his fingers. "So I'm a grown man, and I can't write my own name. There's no shame I haven't already made my peace with on that score." Naomi held his eye. "There's no shame in it at all," she said. "The shame belongs to the men who made that law, and it'll follow them, not you. A law that makes it a crime to teach a child to read is a law that knows what it's doing. It knows that a man who can read is a man who can't be lied to so easy. That's the whole reason for it. Keeping you from your letters was never about you being unable. It was about somebody being afraid of what you'd do once you could." She tapped the slate. "Well, that law doesn't run in this kitchen. Sit down." Isaiah looked at the slate. He looked at the chalk. He sat down. She didn't crowd him. She showed him the shapes the same way she'd shown. "Sarah, don't let me draw it for you. Find it yourself." And Isaiah Boone, who could gentle the meanest horse in the territory with his bare hands, took the chalk in fingers that didn't quite know what to do with it, and made an I, then a wobbling S. It took him a long while. The whole word, Isaiah. He worked at it like he worked at everything, slow and stubborn and complete, and when it was done, he sat back and looked at it on the slate, his own name, in his own hand. The first time in his life. He didn't say anything. His jaw worked. And then this man, this hard, dignified, fully grown man, put one hand over his eyes, and his shoulders shook just once, and he let them. Naomi looked away to give him the room. She busied herself with the rag. She'd known he might need that, and she gave it to him, the small mercy of not being watched, while a thing broke open in you that had been shut a long time. "There," she said after a moment to the window, not to him. "Now there's a thing in the world that wasn't there this morning. Isaiah Boone can write his name, and nobody, not one soul on this earth, can ever make that untrue again." Isaiah wiped his face with the heel of his hand. He picked up the chalk, and he wrote it again, steadier this time, and then again, like a man who'd found water and meant to drink his fill. Caleb stood in the dark of the hall where neither of them could see him, and he didn't go in, because some moments aren't yours to step into. He just stood there with his hand on the doorframe and felt that old nailed-shut door in his chest lean open another inch. He'd thought 6 years ago that the warm part of his life was over, that he'd bury it with his wife and his son and live out his days a useful, hollow man. He'd made his peace with that, the way Isaiah had made his peace with his letters. He was starting to think he'd been wrong about what was over, about what was possible to get back. That night, late, Naomi couldn't sleep either. The day had stirred something up. Daniel, mostly. Teaching always brought him close. He'd been the one who taught her. Evenings by their own fire, a young husband patient with a young wife who'd never had the chance to learn. Some nights the missing of him was a dull thing she could carry. Other nights it had teeth. She got up quiet so as not to wake the children and lit a stub of candle. Daniel's trunk was still where it had ended up, shoved in the corner of the spare room. It had followed them through every move and every loss, the one thing she hadn't sold, because selling it would have felt like selling him. She hadn't opened it since before he died. She wasn't sure why she opened it now. Grief has its own logic at midnight. His coat was on top. She pressed it to her face, and it didn't smell like him anymore. And she made herself put it down before it could undo her. Underneath were the papers. Daniel had been a saver of paper. Every receipt, every record, the deed to the lost homestead that she couldn't look at, his discharge from the cavalry, letters from his mother who was years dead. And underneath all of it, folded in oilcloth, a document she'd never seen. She unfolded it by the candle. It was old, older than their marriage. The ink had gone brown. It was a deed of a kind, but not for the homestead. for something she didn't understand at first. The language thick and legal. She read it twice, 3 times, slow, the way she'd learned to read a thing that mattered. And then she understood it, and her hands went cold. It was a water right, a registered, recorded, lawful claim to the water of Calder Creek, the creek that ran down out of the high country, through the old homestead ground and on east, across the dry tract past the river. Daniel's father had filed it, decades back, when the country was open and a man could claim such a thing. It had passed to Daniel, and from Daniel, it had passed to her and her children. Naomi sat back on her heel. She knew that dry tract. Everyone knew it. It had sat useless for years because there was no water to work it useless to anyone who didn't hold the right to the creek. Useless to anyone but the man who'd been quietly, patiently buying up the surrounding parcels for 2 years. The man building towards something. The man who'd called a year's note due in 30 days in the dead of winter and broken a family and never once explained why he'd wanted that particular 40 acres so badly. Augustus Thorne. There are things about that woman and about your own land that you don't know, Thorne had told Caleb. There's a question of what's whose out past the river and who's got a right to what runs through it. He knew. Thorne knew about this paper. That was why he'd wanted the homestead. That was why he'd broken Daniel. Not for 40 acres of failed wheat, for the water that ran through it. And he'd thought when Daniel died and the wheat scattered, that the right had scattered too, that a woman with nothing wouldn't know what she held. But Daniel had saved his papers. Daniel always saved his paper. Naomi knelt there in the candlelight, with the cold deed in her hands, and felt the whole shape of it settle over her at once. The loss, the cruelty, the reason behind a cruelty that had never made sense. She had not been ruined by bad luck. She had been robbed on purpose by a man who'd wanted what was in her hands and had set out to take it. And the proof had been sitting in Daniel's trunk the whole time. She didn't sleep at all. She sat up the rest of the night with the deed and the candle, reading it again every time she half convinced herself she dreamed it. She hadn't. The brown ink stayed brown ink. The seal stayed a seal. By the time gray came into the window, she had it close to memorized, and she'd made up her mind about exactly one thing. She would not run on it half-cocked, and she would not say a word until she understood what she held. She held it through breakfast, through the morning's work. She held it like a coal in her chest. But Caleb knew her face by now, knew it better than she'd have liked. He came in at midday for coffee and looked at her once across the kitchen and set his cup down without drinking. "What's happened?" he said. "Not a question. Walk with me," Naomi said, "where the children can't hear." They went out to the barn, into the long, quiet aisle of it, where the horses breathed and the cold was less. She'd brought the oilcloth packet inside her coat. She took it out and put it in his hands without a word, and let him read it himself, because she'd decided he was a man who'd rather come to a thing on his own than be led to it. She watched him read it the way she had. Once fast, then slow. She watched the moment he understood. He looked up. "This is Calder Creek. Yes, this is a recorded right to all of it, the whole flow." He looked back down at it like it might change. "This passed to Daniel, from his father, and from Daniel to me," Naomi said, "and to my children." "Read the last part." He read the last part, and she saw something move across his face. Not surprise. Exactly. The opposite of surprise. The look of a man watching a thing he'd half suspected click into place. "This is what Thorne wants," Caleb said. "This is why my husband is dead," said Naomi. The words came out flat and certain, and they hung there in the cold barn air. "The dry tract past the river," she went on. "It's worthless without water. Thorne's been buying the land around it for 2 years. You told me that yourself the first week. He means to build a dam, a settlement, something. But he can't do any of it without the right to Calder Creek. And the right to Calder Creek doesn't belong to him." She took the deed back, gentle like it was alive. "It belongs to me. It always belonged to us. He knew it. He's known it longer than I have. That's why he wanted our 40 acres so badly that he'd ruin a family to get them in the dead of winter. He thought the water came with the ground. He thought if he took the homestead, he'd take the creek. But the right's not tied to the homestead," Caleb said slowly. following. It's its own claim. It went with Daniel, and then with you. And he didn't know I had the paper. Naomi's voice shook, just at the edge. He thought it died with Daniel, or got lost when we got scattered. A widow with 3 children sleeping in a barn, what would she know about water law? He thought I had nothing. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, and had no laughter in it. Everyone thought I had nothing. The whole town's been so busy pitying me or talking about me. And the entire time, the one thing this man would burn down a family to get, I've been carrying it from boarding house to barn to your spare room, folded up in my dead husband's coat. Caleb was quiet a long moment. Then he did a thing she didn't expect. He took his hat off, slow, the way he had that first night in the snow, and he stood there holding it. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I want to say something, and I want you to hear all of it before you answer. Say it. I could make this easy for you." He turned the hat in his hand. "I've got money, and I've got lawyers, and I've got a name in this county that carries. I could buy that right off you today for a fair price, more than fair. I'd see to that. And you and your children would be set for life, and you'd never have to think about Augustus Thorne again. You could walk away clean. I want you to know that offer's real, and it's on the table, and there's no shame in taking it." She looked at him, steady. But I'm not going to do it," Caleb said. "And I'll tell you why." He set the hat down on a barrel. "'Cause for 2 years, that man has been treating you like a thing instead of a person, like a problem he could clear off, a piece of ground. He took your land with a pen. He took your husband with a worry he planted on purpose. He's been ready to scoop up your children's birthright the second. Nobody was looking, because he was sure dead. Sure that a poor widow couldn't possibly understand what she held." Caleb's voice stayed low and even, which was worse, somehow, than if he'd shouted. "And if I buy it off you now, even kind, even fair, then I'm just one more rich man stepping in to handle the helpless little woman's affairs for her. And you'd let me, because you're tired, and God knows you've earned the rest. But it'd be one more man deciding what happens to you. And I've watched you for 3 months, Naomi Carter, and the one thing I will not do is take the deciding out of your hands." The barn was very still. A horse shifted its weight. "They told you that you had nothing," Caleb said. "That was always the lie. You had the most valuable thing in this whole valley folded up in a dead man's coat. They just wanted you to forget you had it. Because a person who forgets what they hold is easy to take it from." He looked at her. "I'm not going to buy your right. I'm going to do something harder. I'm going to help you learn how to keep it, how the law works, how claim gets defended, what a man like Thorne can and can't do to you. So that when this is over, and it's going to get ugly before it's over, you stand on your own ground, holding your own paper, and every soul in Mercy Creek knows you won it. Not that I won it for you. That you did." Naomi looked at him for a long time. She had spent 4 days once, being handed kindness on the way to a closing door. She had spent 3 months earning every meal, so that no man could say she'd taken what she hadn't paid for. And she had not, in all of it, until this exact moment in a cold barn, had a man offer her the one thing she'd been starving for and hadn't let herself name. Not rescue, not charity, not even safety. He was offering her back her own standing. He was offering to treat her as the equal she'd always insisted on being and never been allowed to be. She felt the thing she'd been holding stiff in her chest the whole long night finally give a little. "All right," she said. Her voice came out rough. She cleared it. "All right, teach me then the way I taught Isaiah his letter. Show me, but let me find it myself." "That's the only way I know how," Caleb said. And for the first time since the snow, Naomi Carter lifted her head and looked a man square in the eye, not as someone he'd saved, but as someone standing level with him on the same ground. They worked at it for 2 weeks. Caleb sent for everything he could. Lay hands on the territorial statutes, on water claims, the recording books from the county seat, and old friends' letters explaining what held up in court and what. And in the evenings, after the children's lessons, the kitchen table changed hands. Now it was Naomi bent over the papers, and Caleb across from her, and the two of them, working through the law of it, line by line, while Bess pretended not to listen. and listened to every word. Naomi took to it the way she took to everything. Hungry, fast, stubborn. She learned that her right was senior older than any claim Thorne could buy or forge, and that in water law, older won. She learned what he'd have to prove and what she'd have to. She learned the words for things, which mattered, because a person who has the words for a thing can't be talked in circles around it. And somewhere in those 2 weeks, the thing between her and Caleb that had been growing quiet all winter stopped being quiet. It wasn't anything you could point. It was the way he'd push a cup of coffee across to her without being asked. The way she'd save him the chair with the good light. The way their hands would both reach for the same page and neither would pull back as fast as they used to. Two people who'd each shut a door inside themselves a long time ago. Standing close to those doors now, neither one quite ready to say so. Bess saw it. Bess saw everything. She didn't say a word, but she started cooking like there was something to celebrate. Then, on a gray Tuesday at the end of those 2 weeks, a rider came up the drive. Not Thorne. Thorne didn't ride. Thorne sent. This was a clerk from the bank, a thin, nervous man in town, clothes wrong for the weather, and he sat his hired horse stiff in the yard and would not come inside. He handed Caleb a folded letter sealed. For Mrs. Carter, the clerk said. Mr. Thorne said to put it in her hand directly. But he glanced at the house, at the smoke from the chimney, at the warmth he wasn't being asked into. I'll trust you to see she gets it. He turned the horse and was gone before Caleb could say a word. Naomi opened it at the kitchen table, with the children sent out of the room. Caleb stood at her shoulder. Bess stood at the stove, with her hands gone still. It was short. Thorne wasted no words when threat was the point of it. He knew, the letter said, that she had come into possession of a certain document. He was prepared to be generous. He would purchase the water right of Calder Creek for a sum named below, and the sum was an insult, a fraction of its worth, the kind of number a man offers when the offer isn't really the point. She had 30 days to accept. And then the last line, the line that made Naomi's blood go to ice. Should you decline, I would remind you that the courts take a hard view of children raised in irregular circumstances, fatherless, without lawful means, dependent on the charity of an unmarried man not their kin. It would grieve me to see those children removed to more suitable care. But the law is the law, and a mother's fitness is a fair question. I trust you will be sensible. A. Thorne. The kitchen was dead silent. Naomi read it twice. Her face did not move. But Caleb, who knew that face now, watched the color drain out of it, and watched her hands, flat on the table, begin very slightly to shake, not the way they'd shaken from cold that first night, but worse. She set the letter down. He's not after the water anymore, she said quietly. Or he is. But he's found a better lever. She looked up, and her eyes had gone somewhere hard and far. He's going to come for my children. She didn't sleep. And this time, it wasn't grief that kept her up. It was the cold arithmetic of a man who'd found the one thing she couldn't fight with a deed, the water rights she could defend. Caleb had taught her that. Her claim was senior. Her paper was sound, and on the matter of the creek, she could stand in any court in the territory and hold her ground. But her children weren't a matter of water law. Her children were a question of fitness. And fitness, she was learning, wasn't a thing you proved with a paper. It was a thing other people decided about you. A poor woman, a widow, living unwed, under a strange man's roof. Thorne didn't need to win that argument. He only needed to make it loud enough, in front of the right people, that the question itself did the damage. By morning, her hands had stopped shaking. That was worse, in a way. The shaking had been fear. What replaced it was colder, and went down deeper. She found Caleb in the kitchen before the sun. He filed it, she said. She had the second letter, the one the county clerk's boy had ridden out with at first light, official this time, stamped. A petition to the county. He's asking the court to find me unfit and remove the children. To she read the words like, they tasted of metal, more suitable care, the poorhouse. Or worse, there's a man comes through in spring with a train, takes orphans and near orphans east, parcels them out to whoever'll have them for the work. Her voice didn't break. She wouldn't let it. He's saying, my children aren't really mine to keep. that a woman in my circumstances has no standing to hold them. Caleb took the paper. Read it. His jaw set in a way she'd come to know meant something had crossed a line in him that didn't get uncrossed. On what grounds, he said. On the grounds that I'm poor, that I'm widowed, that I live here with you, and we're not married, and that's improper, and a court might see it his way. She sat down because her legs had decided to stop. He's not even hiding it, Caleb, the water right, and this. He names them in the same letter. Give him the creek, and the children stay. Keep the creek and lose them. That's the trade. He's using my children as the price of my water. The word came out of her before she could stop it. Like their livestock, she said. Like they're a thing to be bargained. They told the children that afternoon. Not all of it. But Mercy was 9 and old in the eyes, and she'd have known a lie, and Naomi had decided a long time ago she wouldn't lie to her children to make herself feel better. So she told them, plain and small, that a man in town was trying to make trouble for the family, and that nobody was going anywhere, and that they were safe. Mercy heard her out with that straight-backed stillness she had. Is it Mr. Thorne? Mercy said. Not really a question. It is. The one who took our home. Yes. Mercy nodded, slow, like she was filing it where she kept the rest. He's a bad man, she said, simply. The way children say true things. He's done bad things, Naomi said. That's the part we can know for certain. What's in his heart is between him and God. But what he's done, yes, that we can name. Eli, who was 6 and understood about half of it, and felt all of it, climbed into Caleb's lap. He did it without thinking. That was the thing. He'd been doing it for weeks now, easing toward this big quiet man the way a cold thing eases toward a fire. And Caleb had let him, careful, never reaching, never pushing, just being a warm and steady place a small boy could come to. And Eli climbed up into his lap and leaned his head on Caleb's chest and said, into his shirt, not even loud, "You won't let him take us, will you, Pa?" The kitchen went still. Pa, the boy hadn't meant anything by it. That was the whole of it. He hadn't decided it or worked up to it. It had just fallen out of him, the truest word he had for the shape this man had come to fill. And the second it was out, Eli felt the size of it and went rigid and pulled back and looked up at Caleb with sudden fear, the fear of a child who thinks he's said the wrong thing and is about to be told so. Caleb Hart sat very still with the boy in his lap. For 6 years he had not been anybody's pa. He had buried the only child who'd ever had the right to call him that, a son who died too small to call him anything at all, and he had closed the door on the whole of it and lived behind that door, like a man lives in a house with the curtains drawn. And here was this boy, not his, and calling him that, and already flinching, already braced to be corrected, because the world had taught Eli Carter, young, that good things get taken back. Caleb felt the old shut door come open, not an inch this time, all the way. He put his big hand on the back of the boy's head, gentle, and brought it back down to his chest. No, Caleb said. His voice came out rough, and he didn't try to fix it. I won't let him take you. Any of you. You hear me, Eli? The boy nodded against his shirt. And you didn't say anything wrong just now. You said something right. You can call me that as long as you want to. And the day you don't want to anymore, that's all right too. But it's yours to keep. Nobody's taking it back. Naomi had turned to the window. She was finding something very important to look at. Out in the snow that night, Caleb laid the ranch deed on the kitchen table. He laid it down between them, like a man laying down a card. I've been thinking on it all day, he said, and here's where I've landed. Thorne's whole game is that you've got no standing. A poor widow, no means, no man. No claim on the children that a court can't pick at. He tapped the deed, so we take that away from him. We take away every grounds he's got. Naomi looked at the deed, then at him. Caleb, I'll petition to adopt them, he said. All 3. Make it legal. Make it iron. Mercy, Eli the baby. Give them my name, and a roof that's deeded, and a father the court can't argue with. He held her eye. And I'll marry you. Not he stopped, started again, and she saw the careful man working hard to say a thing plainly, not as a trade, not to win a case. I won't insult you by pretending a marriage to fix a lawsuit is a marriage, but I'll say the true part, which is that I'd marry you anyhow. I've known that a while. I'm just saying it now because the timing's forcing my hand, And I'd rather you heard it from me, ugly and honest, than pretty and false. The kitchen was very warm and very quiet. Naomi sat with her hands folded on the table and her heart doing something complicated. "You'd do that," she said. "Hand your name and your land to 3 children that aren't yours to stop one man." "They're not nobody's children," Caleb said. "They're yours, and I've come to." He looked away, then made himself look back. "I've come to love them, the boy especially today, but the girl, too, with her straight back, and the baby, who doesn't know me from a fence post, but grabs my finger anyhow. So no, ma'am, I wouldn't be doing it to stop a man. I'd be doing it because I want it. The stopping of Thorn is just what's making me say so out loud before I was ready." Naomi looked down at the deed. "I told you I'd take no charity," she said quietly. "This isn't charity. Charity's a thing you give and walk away from. This is the opposite of walking away." He reached across the table, slow enough that she could pull back, and she didn't. And he put his hand over her folded one. "But I'll tell you the same thing I told you in the barn. The deciding stays yours. I've said my piece. You take all the time you need, and whatever you choose, the offer to adopt those children stands either way, married or not. You can have my name on that petition tomorrow. No strings. Because no court should get to call a good mother unfit, and I won't let them. That part's not even about you and me. That part's just right." Naomi turned her hands over under his, so they were palm to palm. She didn't say yes, not that night. She wasn't ready, and he hadn't asked her to be, and that he'd handed her the choice, and meant it was most of why she already knew what her answer was going to be. "Ask me again," she said, "when it's not on fire all around us. When I can say yes for the right reasons, and not because I'm scared. Will you do that? I'll ask you every Tuesday for the rest of my life, if that's what it takes," Caleb said. And she laughed. A real one, surprised out of her. The first real laugh she'd laughed in his hearing. The fire came that same night. She woke to, not to flame to the smell. Smoke, where there shouldn't be smoke, sharp and wrong in the cold air. Then the sound, that low, hungry roar, a man never forgets once he's heard it. And then Caleb's boots, loud on the stairs, and his voice, hard, awake, calling for Gaines, calling for water. The hay barn was burning. Naomi got to the window in time to see it go up, the whole north end of it, sheeted in orange, the light of it, throwing long, mad shadows across the snow, and men already running, dark shapes against the glare, and the horses screaming. She knew before anyone said. The way she'd known the carriage in the yard meant trouble. You feel a thing before it arrives. This was no accident. No lamp left lit, no spark from a stove. The hay barn sat off on its own, cold and dark and far from any flame. Somebody had set it. Somebody had ridden out across Caleb Hart's land in the dead of a winter night and put fire to it on purpose. And in the orange light, holding her children back from the window, Naomi understood that the trade Thorn had offered her in his letter had only ever been the polite version. This was the other version. This was what be sensible meant when a man like that said it. A barn fire in winter is a particular kind of terror. Everything that should fight the flame is frozen. The water in the trough is ice. The creek is ice. The well comes up slow and cold. And a bucket line in that weather is men's hands cracking open while the fire eats faster than the line can feed. Caleb knew all of this in the first 3 seconds, the way a man who's run a ranch his whole life knows the arithmetic of disaster before he's awake enough to dread it. "The horses," he shouted. "Forget the hay's gone. Get the horses out." The hay was already lost. You don't save burning hay. You just decide what it doesn't take with it. And what it would take, if nobody moved, was the 8 horses stalled in the south end, screaming now, mad with the smell, throwing themselves at the gates. Isaiah Boone was already running for them. He went in low, a wet rag over his face, into the smoke, where Caleb couldn't follow fast enough, into the part of the barn that hadn't caught yet but would, into the screaming and the heat and the dark. And one by one the horses came bolting out into the snow, eyes white, trailing him, because there was one man on that whole place they'd follow through fire. And Isaiah was him. 7 came out. Caleb counted them in the firelight. 7. The 8th was the old mare, half blind, too frightened to move, and Isaiah went back in for her. The roof of the north end came down while he was inside. Naomi heard the scream of it. From the house, the great, cracking groan, and then the crash and the new gout of sparks going up into the black sky, and she heard Caleb's voice go ragged, shouting Isaiah's name, and for a long, terrible moment there was nothing, just the fire, just the roar. Then Isaiah came out of the smoke, leading the old mare by a hand twisted in her mane, both of them black with soot, the man coughing so hard he couldn't stand straight, and he got 10 feet clear of the barn and went down on his knees in the snow and stayed there, heaving. Caleb got to him first, got an arm around him, hauled him back from the heat. "You damn fool," Caleb said, and his voice was shaking. "You went back in for a mare. You damn brave. Couldn't leave her." Isaiah got it out between coughs. "Couldn't? She's blind, Caleb. She'd just have stood there. Couldn't leave her. To stand there and burn. And here's the thing about that night, the thing Naomi would think about for the rest of her life. The town came. They saw the glow from miles off, the way you can on a clear, cold night, and they came. Men who'd whispered about Caleb in the churchyard, men who'd crossed the road. Pell came, and the Aldous boys, and old enemies and old friends both, riding hard through the dark with empty barrels and shovels, and they fell into a line at the well without being asked. Because whatever a man feels about his neighbor in daylight, you don't let his place burn at night. Not out here. Out here, the cold is the enemy that's bigger than any quarrel between men, and they all knew it. And they came. By dawn, the fire was beaten. The hay barn was a black ruin and a smell that would hang over the place for weeks. But the house stood. The other barn stood. The horses stood in the far corral. All ate, breathing, and the men of Mercy Creek stood in the gray light, sooty and exhausted, and looked at what they'd saved together, and something had shifted that none of them would have put words to. It almost shifted back. In that worn-out moment after, when men are too tired to mind their tongues, one of them, a hand from another spread, a man named Doyle who'd come with the rest, looked at Isaiah Boone sitting in the snow with a blanket around him and said, "Not even cruel, just careless, just stupid. The way the careless lie lives in a man so deep, he forgets it's there. Surprised thee," and he used a word. The word said it flat, like it was the man's name. Surprised, he went back in for a horse, worth nothing. The yard went quiet. It went quiet, the way a room goes quiet when something's been dropped that can't be picked back up. Caleb Hart walked over. He was black with soot and gray with exhaustion, and there was nothing soft left in his face at all. "Doyle," he said, "that man you just put a name to. He's got a name. It's Isaiah Boone. And not 2 hours ago, he walked into a fire twice to save my stock, and went back a third time for a blind mare that wasn't worth $1, because he couldn't stand to let a helpless creature burn, which is more than I can say for some men who'll stand in a yard their neighbor just helped save and find breath to be small." Doyle's face went red. "I didn't mean nothing by it. That's the trouble with you," Caleb said. "You never do. The not meaning is how it lives. A man doesn't have to mean a thing for it to be poison." He turned, and his voice came up so the whole tired yard could hear it. And these were men who'd just bled their hands raw beside him, and they listened. "I'll say this once, and then I'm done, because I'm tired, and so are you. And we've earned our rest. There is an idea loose in this country that you can rank a man by his color, by his coin, by whose hand he was born to. And I'm telling you to your faces, it is a lie, and the meanest kind, because it lets a small man feel tall by standing on a better one." He pointed at Isaiah, who'd gotten to his feet now, blanket falling, standing straight despite the cough. "That man is owed exactly what every man in this yard is owed tonight. A handshake, the use of his name, the respect of being called what he is, which is brave, and which is equal. Not more. I'll not have him thanked like a pet for doing a man's work, but not 1 inch less either. The same. Because that's what the word equal means, and it doesn't bend for anybody's comfort, including yours." Nobody said a word. Then Pellgruff, plain Pell, who'd ridden 2 miles through the dark with a barrel in his wagon, walked across the yard to Isaiah Boone and stuck out his hand. "Boone," he said. "That was about the bravest thing I ever saw. Pleased to know your name." And Isaiah looked at the offered hand. For a second, Naomi watched him look at it, watched a lifetime go across his face, and then he took it and shook it, equal to equal, and said, "Pell," and that was all. And it was everything. One by one, the others did the same. Not all of them. Doyle didn't. Doyle slunk off to his horse. But most. Most of the tired, sooty men of Mercy Creek crossed that yard and shook Isaiah Boone's hand in the gray dawn. And the thing that had shifted in the night stayed shifted. There was one more thing. As the wagons were leaving, a fine carriage that had no business at a fire came up the drive and stopped well back. Uncertain, Verna Thorne sat in it, wrapped in her furs, and she did not get out at first. She'd come to see it. That much was plain. Come to look at the ruin her husband had bought. Maybe she'd expected to feel something pleasant. Maybe she hadn't known what she'd feel. What Naomi watched cross the woman's face, standing on the porch with Pearl on her hip, was not pleasant at all. Verna looked at the black bones of the barn. She looked at the exhausted men. She looked at Isaiah Boone, soot-blind, being shaken by the hand. And she looked, for a long moment, at the 3 children standing in the doorway of a house her husband meant to take them from. Then she did a strange thing. She had her driver hand down a bundle from the carriage blankets, good wool ones, a whole armload, and she carried them herself, awkward in her fine boots in the snow, up to the porch, and she set them down without quite meeting Naomi's eyes. "For the children," Verna said, "it's cold." And then, very low, almost to herself, "I didn't know he meant to." She stopped. She didn't finish it. She turned and went back to her carriage, fast, like she'd said too much, like the saying had frightened her. Naomi stood holding her baby and watched the banker's wife drive away. She didn't trust it. She wasn't a fool, but she'd been a teacher long enough to know what it looks like when something cracks open in a person that's been shut a long time. She'd watched it on Isaiah's face over a slate. She'd felt it in her own chest in a cold barn. And she just watched the first hairline crack run through Verna Thorne. A man could build his whole cruelty on the loyalty of the people around him. But loyalty is a thing that has to be deserved to be kept. And Augustus Thorne, Naomi thought, had just spent some of his on a fire he should never have set. Inside, later, when the children were finally asleep, and the house smelled of smoke, and the ruins still smoldered in the yard, Bess sat down heavy at the kitchen table, across from Naomi and Caleb. She had something in her hand, an old letter, the paper soft, with handling, folded and refolded many times by someone who couldn't decide whether to keep it or burn it. "I should have given you this a long time ago," Bess said. Her voice was not steady. "I've carried it 3 years, and told myself it wasn't my business. After tonight, after what that man did tonight, I'm done telling myself that." She set it on the table. "It's about how Thorne got the Carter place," Bess said, "and it's about a signature, one that Daniel Carter never wrote." Bess's letter wasn't proof, not by itself, but it was a thread, and Naomi had learned by now that you pull a thread to see what's tied to the other end. The letter was from Bess's cousin, who'd clerked at the bank for a season before Thorne let him go. He'd written it, half drunk and half scared, the way a man writes a thing he needs out of his chest. He'd seen Daniel Carter's note. He'd seen the signature on the extension, the paper that supposedly proved Daniel had agreed to the cruel 30-day terms. And the signature, the cousin wrote, was wrong. He'd seen Daniel sign his name a dozen times. Daniel signed it plain and slow, a careful man's hand. This was fast, practiced, somebody else's idea of Daniel's name. "He forged it," Naomi said. She set the letter down with care, the way you set down something that could cut you. Thorne forged Daniel's agreement to the terms. Daniel never signed off on 30 days. He'd never have signed away his own family in winter. Thorne wrote it himself, or paid a man to. "It's one nervous clerk's word in a letter," Caleb said. He wasn't doubting. He was teaching her the way he'd promised. "A court won't hang a banker on that. We need more. We need the note itself, and someone who'll swear to the real hand, and we need it before the custody hearing, because if we can show the foreclosure was a fraud, the whole thing he's built on top of it comes down." The fitness petition, all of it. A man can't take your children to cover a crime. So they pulled the thread. Reverend Hale knew the families. A minister knows who's hurting in a town, even the ones too proud to say. And there were more than the Carter. That was the thing they found. Riding out in the thaw to homestead after homestead, sitting at kitchen tables with coffee going cold. Thorne hadn't broken one family. He'd broken a string of them, always the same way, a note called early, terms that couldn't be met, a signature on the papers that the man who'd supposedly signed it didn't quite remember signing. Small farmers, poor one, people nobody would believe over a banker, picked exactly because nobody would believe them. He chose us on purpose, said a man named Hadley, who'd lost 80 acres 2 years back, same as he chose the Carters. Folks with no money to fight and no name to be heard. He turned his coffee cup. Who's the court going to take? Augustus Thorne or a busted dirt farmer? He knew. He always knew. That's how a man like that does it. He robs the people the law won't listen to, because he knows the law won't listen to. Then we'll make it listen, Naomi said. Not to one of us, to all of us at once. She'd learned that somewhere in the long winter. One poor widow's word was nothing, but 6 families telling the same story, in the same shape, about the same man that was a pattern. And a pattern was a thing a court couldn't cross the road to avoid. It's not about getting even, Hale said gentle. On the ride home, he'd seen something hard come into her, and he meant to speak to it. I want to make sure you hear that, Naomi. Justice and revenge wear the same coat sometimes, but they're not the same man underneath. Revenge wants Thorne to suffer. Justice wants those families to have back what was theirs. Keep your eye on the second one. It's the only one worth the trouble, and it's the only one that heals anybody. Naomi wrote a while before she answered. I want both, she said honestly. I'd be lying if I said I didn't want him to suffer. But you're right that it's the second one I'll fight for. The families come first. Thorne's punishment is just what's left over. That'll do, Hale said. A person doesn't have to have a clean heart to do a right thing. They just have to choose the right thing with the heart they've got. The break came from inside the house Thorne had built. It came from Verna. She came alone, in the carriage, on a gray afternoon. And this time she got out, and she came up to the door, and she stood there in her furs, looking smaller than Naomi had ever seen her. She had a ledger under her arm. My husband keeps 2 sets of books, Verna said, before anyone could speak. Her voice was flat, the flatness of a woman who's decided a thing and is making herself say it before the nerve goes. One for the examiner, one for himself. I've known for years. I told myself it wasn't my concern. A wife isn't supposed to look in her husband's books. She set the ledger on the table. Her hands shook. But I watched him burn a man's barn. I watched those children stand in a doorway he means to drag them out of, and I'm done not looking. Naomi opened the ledger. Caleb read over her shoulder. Hale, who'd come for supper, leaned in. It was all there. The early called notes, the term, and besides several of them, in Thorne's own private hand, small notes to himself, which signatures he'd seen to, which families would give no trouble. The dry tract and the words, Calderwater, secure. Carter parcel, written plain as a grocery list. That's a confession, Caleb said quietly, in his own hand. That hangs him. Verna had turned away. I'll testify, she said to the window. I'll stand up in front of the whole town and say what I know. It'll cost me everything. She stopped. It doesn't matter what he'll do. I should have looked years ago. I'm looking now. Naomi went and stood beside her. She didn't touch her. She just stood. It took courage to come here, Naomi said, more than it would have taken to keep quiet. I won't forget that. Whatever happened, a person who does wrong and turns and tells the truth at their own cost, that's not the same as a person who never did wrong at all. But it's not nothing either. It's worth something. It's worth a great deal. Verna's eyes filled. She didn't let it fall. Thank you, she said, for saying so. The night before the hearing, a knock came at the door after dark. A big man Caleb didn't know, in a town coat with a wagon waiting. He had an envelope in one hand, thick with money, and the other hand he kept where Caleb could see it. Didn't need to move to be a threat. Mr. Thorne sends his regards, the man said, and his last offer. The widow signs over the water, right. Tonight the petition disappears. The children stay, and there's this. He held up the envelope for the trouble. Or, tomorrow goes, how tomorrow goes. And a courtroom's a long, uncertain place for a poor woman to gamble her children in. Caleb looked at the envelope. He looked at the man. You can tell Augustus Thorne, he said, that the lady's already decided. And you can tell him she didn't need my help to decide it. Now, get off my porch before I forget. I'm a patient man. The wagon left. Inside, Naomi stood holding Pearl, and she was not shaking at all. Tomorrow, she said, I stand up myself. I don't want a lawyer speaking for me on the part that matters. I'll have one for the law of it. But the part where I tell that room who I am, that's mine to say. It is, Caleb said. The courthouse couldn't hold the town, but the town came anyway. They stood along the walls and crowded the doorway and spilled out onto the steps in the spring cold. Word traveled, and everyone knew that today the rich rancher and the barn fire and the widow, with 3 children, all came to a point in one room. Thorne sat at the front in a good coat with a lawyer from the territorial capital who had soft hands and a hard mouth. He looked, Naomi thought, like a man who'd already won and had come to watch the formality of it. He hadn't reckoned on the families. They came in one at a time when Caleb's lawyer called them. Hadley, the others. 6 of them, plain men and plain women, each telling the same plain story the note called early. The terms no honest man could meet. The signature that wasn't quite their hand. One at a time it was the word of a busted farmer. 6 at a time in the same shape. It was a pattern, and the judge, an old circuit man named Foley, who'd seen a great deal, began to lean forward. Then Caleb's lawyer entered the ledger. He read from Thorne's own hand, the notes to himself. Secure Carter parcel. The room made a sound, low. The sound a crowd makes when a thing it's suspected turns out to be true. Thorne's lawyer rose smooth. Your Honor, a ledger proves nothing of its author. Anyone might have written. I'll swear to who wrote it. Verna Thorne stood up in the 3rd row. She walked to the front in her furs, pale, and she put her hand on the book and swore. And she told the room it was her husband's private ledger, kept in his own hand, in his own desk, for 15 years. She told them about the 2 sets of books. She did not look at her husband once, and her husband looked at her like a man watching the floor open. He forged those signatures, Verna said, or paid for them forged. I've heard him say so. I heard him say the Carter place was worth ruining a family for because of the water. Her voice broke, and she steadied it. And she finished. I should have spoken years ago. I'm speaking now. God forgive me for the waiting. It was over for Thorne. After that, though, it took the rest of the morning to say so. In the language of the law, the forgery, the pattern, the confession in his own hand. Foley's face had gone to stone, but there was still the petition. The children, and that part, Naomi had said, was hers. She took the stand herself. She'd been dreading it, not the questions, but the room. All those faces that knew her only as a story. She handed Pearl to Bess. She walked up. She put her hand on the book, and she looked out at Mercy Creek, the whole of it, the ones who'd shut their doors and the ones who'd opened them, and she found she wasn't afraid anymore. Mr. Thorne says I'm unfit, she said, because I'm poor, because I'm a widow, because I've had to take shelter where I could find it. She kept her voice level, and it carried to the back. I want to tell you what I used to believe. I used to believe that losing everything meant I was nothing, that a person with no money and no land and no husband had no worth. I carried 3 children through a winter, believing it, and it near killed me, because it's a lie, and a lie heavy enough will sink you. The room was silent. Here's the truth I found instead, Naomi said. A person's worth is not in what they own. It's not in their purse or their name or whether their luck has held. A person's worth is in how they treat the people weaker than themselves. That's the whole of it. That's the only ledger that counts. She looked at Thorne. By that measure, I know exactly what I am. I'm a woman who fed her children before herself and worked for every roof she's stood under. And I know what that man is too, a man who breaks the weak for profit and calls it business. She turned back to the judge. I'm not asking this court for charity. I never have. I'm asking it to do the one thing a court is for. Look at what's true, and then tell Mercy Creek what kind of town it's going to be. Foley looked at her a long moment. Then he gave them the morning's rulings. Plain and hard. The foreclosures, fraudulent, reversed. The family's land to be restored. The note against the Carters, void. The water right of Calder Creek, confirmed, lawful, and Naomi Carter. The custody petition, dismissed, with a few cold words about the man who'd brought it. And the matter of Augustus Thorne handed over to the territorial marshal, who was waiting in the hall. Thorne left in the marshal's custody, passed the whole town, and not one soul crossed the road to his side. Outside in the sun, Caleb found her on the steps. He took her hand. He didn't say anything fine. He just held it, and she let him. And then Pearl, on Bess's hip, went into a hard fit of coughing that didn't stop the deep, wet, frightening kind, and every other thing in the world fell away. The fever took Pearl that night and held her 3 days. The doctor came and said what doctors said then, which wasn't much: keep her warm, keep her drinking, and wait and pray. So they did. The whole house did. They took it in shifts that nobody organized. It just happened. Bess and Naomi and Caleb and Mercy, who wouldn't be sent to bed, and Isaiah, who slept in the kitchen in case a horse was needed for the doctor, and even Verna, who came quiet with broth and stayed. On the third night, the fever broke. Pearl woke near dawn, thin and cross and herself, and reached for her mother, and Naomi held her, and wept the way you weep when you've been too afraid to weep for days. And Caleb stood in the doorway of the room where he'd fixed a broken latch one winter night for children who weren't his, and he understood that they were his now, not by any paper, by the 3 days, by the shifts nobody organized, by the simple fact that there was no version of his life left that didn't have 4 people in it. They were a family. It had happened while they weren't looking, the way the most permanent things do. He asked her in May, not on a plain Tuesday with nothing to mark it. He'd thought about that, about doing it small, to prove it wasn't about the case. But Naomi had taught him something over the winter, teaching all those children at the kitchen table that you say the important things out loud and you mark them so that people know they matter. So he waited for a good evening, gold light long across the new grass, and he took her out to the cottonwood by the creek, Calder Creek, running free now under the spring sun. Hers in law, and in fact, the children were up at the house with Bess. He'd planned that, too. He didn't have a ring. He had something else. He put a folded paper in her hands. It was the water right, the deed to Calder Creek, and he'd had it redrawn at the county seat, properly, lawfully, in her name alone, Naomi Carter, sole holder, free and clear. It was already yours, she said, not understanding. It was. I'm giving it to you anyway, Caleb said. So there's no mistaking it. I don't want there to be one soul in this valley, including me, on my own bad days, who can ever say Caleb Hart married a woman for her water, or married her to win her case, or married her to play the hero. He took his hat off, the way he had in the snow, the way he had in the barn. It's yours, the land, the water, the children, your own 2 feet under you. You don't need me for any of it. You proved that in front of the whole town. So when I ask you this, you'll know I'm not asking because you need me. He looked at Naomi Carter. Marry me. Because I'd like to spend my life standing next to the strongest person I ever met. That's all. That's the whole reason. Naomi looked down at the deed in her hand, then up at him. I didn't change your fate, Caleb said. I want that clear too. You changed it. You walked through a door and worked and learned and stood up and won. I just held the door. That's all a person can really do for another one. In the end, hold the door and not cross the road. She started to laugh, and it turned halfway to crying. And she said yes, not out of fear, not out of gratitude, not because she needed saving, but for the one reason that lasts, which is that she'd come to love the man and wanted the life. The creek ran on beside them, free and loud, going where water goes when nothing's holding it back anymore. They married in the white church in June, with the stove cold for once, and the doors thrown open to the warm. Eli walked his mother down the aisle, 6 years old and grave with the weight of the honor, and at the front he handed her to Caleb and then said, clear enough for the whole church to hear. That's my to no one in particular, and everyone. Just stating a fact he was proud of. The church laughed, the good kind, and a few people cried. Isaiah Boone stood up as best man in a coat that had been Caleb's and shook the groom's hand at the front of the church, where 6 months before a man had muttered that the help shouldn't sit, and nobody muttered anything now, because the town had decided, the way a town slowly does, what kind of town it was going to be. That fall, the new room on the back of the house opened as a school, a real one, free, for every child in the valley, the Boone children and the Pell girl and the Homestead children whose families had their land back now, all of them at the same benches, learning off the same slates, because Naomi Hart would teach it no other way. The alphabet never asked a child what color his hands were. She told the county men who came to ask about it, and neither will I. She'd say it to the children, too, the same thing she'd said to Mercy in the worst of the cold, the same thing she'd said to Isaiah over a slate. She'd say it most days, one way or another. There's a great deal in this world that can be taken from you, she'd tell them. Your home, your money, even, God forbid, the people you love. But what you carry in here, and she'd tap her own head, and then her own chest, the knowing, and the kindness, and the plain refusal to think yourself better or worse than the soul beside you that nobody takes. That's yours. That's the only thing that's ever truly yours. Learn everything. And remember that the measure of you was never your purse. It was always how you treated the person who had less. Outside, the Montana winters came on, year after year, cold enough to end things that weren't built to last. But the house at the Hart place held its warmth. It had been built to. And the people in it had chosen, each of them, to hold the door open against everything the season could send for each other. And for the next cold stranger who might come up the drive with nothing but 3 children and a handful of courage, looking for somebody who'd see a person where the world only saw a problem. The creek ran on under it all, in the direction it had always meant to go, free.
This story exists within the realm of fiction, where imagination shapes reality. Any similarities to real-life individuals, organizations, or events are entirely coincidental. The author does not endorse or represent any real entity through the content of this work. And so, when the last page of this story closes, what remains is not only the sound of the creek running free through the valley, but the quiet truth it carries with it. A person's worth is never measured by what they have lost. Naomi Carter entered this story with nothing the world respected: no land, no money, no husband, no protection except a dull little knife in her hand, and the fierce courage of a mother standing between her children and the cold. To the town, she was a burden. To the banker, she was an obstacle. To the cruel and comfortable, she was simply another poor widow to be pushed aside. But the story teaches us that people are never as small as the world tries to make them. Sometimes the person everyone pities is the one holding the strongest truth. Sometimes the woman believed to have nothing is the one carrying the key to justice. Caleb Hart's journey reminds us that kindness is not weakness. True kindness is not polite words or easy charity given from a safe distance. True kindness opens the door in a storm. It gives shelter without stealing dignity. It helps without taking control. Caleb did not save Naomi by making her dependent on him. He honored her by standing beside her, while she learned to stand fully in her own strength. That is one of the deepest values of this story. Love is not ownership, and help is not the same as rescue. The best kind of love does not make someone smaller, it gives them room to rise. Naomi's story also teaches us the power of knowledge. Land can be taken, money can disappear, a house can burn, a reputation can be attacked by cruel tongues. But what a person learns, what a person understands, and what a person carries inside the mind and the heart cannot be foreclosed upon. When Naomi teaches the children Isaiah and the forgotten families of the valley, She is giving them more than letters. She is giving them freedom. She is proving that education is not a privilege for the chosen few, but a light that belongs to every child. Every worker has ever been told they are less. This story asks us to look carefully at the kind of people we become when someone else is suffering. Do we cross the road, keeping our hands clean and our reputation safe, or do we stop? Do we open the door? Do we call a man by his name? Do we defend a mother when the powerful try to break her? Mercy Creek had to answer that question, and so do we, because every community is judged not by how it treats the rich, the strong, and the respected, but by how it treats the poor, the widowed, the orphaned, the different, and the forgotten. In the end, Augustus Thorne lost because he believed everything could be bought, threatened, forged, or taken. He believed fear was stronger than truth. He believed a poor woman would not know what she held. But truth has a way of surviving in hidden places. It waits in old trunks, in honest ledgers, in the memory of wronged families, and in the courage of those who finally decide to speak. Justice may come late, but when brave people stand together, even the most powerful lie begins to fall apart. The meaning of this story is simple, but powerful. Never judge a person by their poverty, their grief, their color, their past, or the trouble they are standing in. Judge them by their courage, their kindness, their honesty, and the way they treat those who have less power than they do. Naomi Carter began as a woman in the snow with nothing but 3 children and a handful of courage. She ended as a teacher, a landholder, a mother, a wife, and a living reminder that dignity can survive even the coldest winter. And perhaps that is why the creek matters so much. For so long, powerful men tried to control it, hide it, and use it for profit. But water was never meant to be chained by greed. Like truth, like knowledge, like love, it was meant to move freely and give life wherever it went. By the end, Calder Creek runs not as a symbol of wealth, but as a symbol of freedom. Naomi found her voice. Caleb opened his heart. The children found a home. Isaiah found his name written by his own hand, and imperfectly learned what kind of place it wanted to become. So the lesson we carry from this Western tale is this: when the storm comes, be the person who opens the door. When the world calls someone worthless, be the one who sees their dignity. When power tries to bury the truth, be brave enough to uncover it. And when you have a seat at the table, make room for someone who has been left outside in the cold. In the end, the truest measure of a life is not what we own, but who we shelter, who we teach, who we stand beside, and what doors we choose to hold open for others.